Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Emily Riley. I'm the Director of Public Engagement at BGC, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's program. Our exhibition, Eileen Gray, closed on October 28th, but we are offering one final virtual tour of the exhibition on November 18th at 1:30. Follow the links that appear in your chat to reserve spots if you're inspired and interested after today's program. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement, which was authored by Curtis Davia, Executive Director of the American Indian Community House, and Jennifer Rittner, founder of Content Matters. While we have the privilege of convening virtually today, we also have the responsibility to acknowledge that many cities and institutions in America were founded on the exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples, including those on whose land, Mannahatta, from which we are hosting this event. The land of the 5 boroughs that make up New York City are the traditional homelands of the Lenape, Merrick, Canarsie, Matinacock, and Rockaway nations. Despite systemic erasures, these lands persist as intertribal lands under the stewardship of many nations and over 115,000 intertribal Native American, First Nations, and Indigenous peoples who currently call New York City home. In addition, I would also like to acknowledge those whose ancestors did not arrive on these shores of their own free will, and whose tremendous cultural, economic, and technological contributions continue to provide the foundations for our lives. Thank you for joining us today. Today's program features Ruth Starr, who is an art historian at Trinity College, Dublin, lecturing in history of Japanese art and architecture from the earliest times to the 20th century. Ruth was the principal consultant on Gray's lacquer maître, Seizo Sugawara, the topic of today's conversation, for the 2013 Eileen Gray exhibition at Centre Pompidou in Paris. Ruth will be in conversation with Emma Cormack, an associate curator here at BGC who served as editorial and curatorial assistant on the Eileen Gray exhibition. Just a couple of Zoom housekeeping. This event today is best experienced if you put your screen in presenter view, which is available at the top right-hand corner of your screen. We'll be showing lots of really beautiful images, and so we want them writ large on your screen if possible. Apologies for the alarm that just went off in my background. So we invite you to submit questions throughout the program using the Q&A function. After Ruth and Emma's conversation, we'll have time for questions, and I'm going to do my best to make sure your questions are answered. So thank you so much for being here, and I am going to hand it over to Emma, who's going to kick us off.
Thanks, Emily, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today for what is sadly our last Eileen Gray event. If you've attended our other Zoom events, you'll have heard about Gray as a designer and an architect, but today, like Emily said, it's all about Gray's longtime friend and collaborator, Seizo Sugawara. So I'll just say quickly that, like Emily mentioned, our exhibition has left our galleries, but it lives on our website, which we encourage you to go and explore, and Nadia will post the link in the chat here. So again, welcome Ruth, and I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for my introduction, Emily and Emma. Thank you for having this conversation with me, and thank you to Natalie for being there in the technical background. But most of all, I'd like to thank the Bard Graduate Center for hosting this lecture, and in particular, I'd like to thank Chloe and Nina for inviting me to contribute to the Eileen Gray catalogue, enabling me to shine some light on the very passive personality that Sugawara seems to have been. So Eileen Gray is perhaps best known for her pioneering work in modernist architecture, but less well known is her acclaimed earlier career as a lacquer furniture designer. And this period reveals Gray's very fine appreciation of lacquer. She seems to have this fine appreciation of the unique characteristics of Japanese lacquer. And today I'm hoping that this brief talk, we'll consider the influences of on Gray, of the pervasiveness in her time of Japanism in general, but the influence in particular of the Japanese sculptor and lacquer specialist Seizo Sugawara, whose dates I have neglected to put at the top of the screen. So I'll just remind you that his dates are 1884 to 1937. This is his birth and death dates. So what we have here on the screen is an example of what we call a Momoyama period, lacquer box of letters, and also then on the right-hand side, we have an inrow from the Komi School of Lacquer. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about those in a moment. So Gray's first encounters with Japanism might have been from an early age as a keen visitor of museums and expositions. Her visits to the South Kensington Museum, which is now known as the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum, which was near her London home, and to the 1900 Paris Exposition were to prove a profound influence. But similar earlier Irish influences should not be overlooked. By the 1880s, the now National Museum of Ireland had acquired numerous Japanese artifacts, and particularly high quality Japanese domestic lacquerware. And this suggests that the Irish cognoscenti and the museum's subsequent donors believed that an awareness of the Japanese arts could have a positive influence on Irish arts and design. At this time, really in the mid to late 19th century, Japanism was all pervasive, even here in Ireland, to the point where one of our most famous poets, W.B. Yeats, he remembers and recalls in his poetry seeing a very famous family in the west of Ireland, the Gore Booth sisters. They, in the mid 1890s, were sitting in a Sligo window wearing silk kimonos. So even in the west of Ireland, it was warm enough to be wearing silk kimonos. I don't think so, but there was definitely a fashion on the Anglo-Irish ascendancy at that time. So the majority of the National Museum's lacquer artifacts were acquired between 1879 and 1897, with a peak of artifacts being acquired in 1897. Now, this suggests the prominence of lacquer display in Ireland, and that it culminated at the young Irish designer's most formative age, indicating and including, I should say, significant pieces of lacquer from as early as the Momoyama period. That's the box of letters that we see here on the left-hand side, a lacquer gold box. 4 letters, and the Momoyama period dates from the late 16th century, early 17th century. And this was acquired by the National Museum in around 1897. And then we have this inrow on the right-hand side. This is an example of the Koami School of Lacquer, and I'm going to come back to this particular school of lacquer at a later stage. So by the beginning of the 20th century, there was sufficient interest in Japanese screens in the British Isles for the Yamanaka and Company to hold an annual exhibition. Prior to this, rather almost like an Oriental bazaar, Oriental dealers, the Yamanakas, had been stateside, mainly on the east coast of the States. But around 1900, they opened up a shop in Bond Street in London, and there was enough interest to hold an annual exhibition and sale of screens in London. And this is exactly when Gray was beginning to study in the Slade School of Art. We also know, it's well known, how she got lessons from D. Charles. So there were many Japanning firms, as they were known, such as D. Charles, and they were who was firmly established in Soho. So just a little bit closer, there was nearby at the Slade School of Art, which had been actually attended 10 years earlier by the Gore Booths, by Constance, the women that I just referenced at the beginning, and who's now better known as Constance Markovitz here in Ireland. So it was a very bohemian, and I know Jennifer Goff has spoken, very widely and strongly, and tried to really emphasize what a bohemian school the the Slade was. And so women's participation, particularly in the Morris arts and crafts movement, was reaching its peak at this time. And while studying there, while studying at the Slade, it seems that Gray admired this deep craftsmanship that was associated with its arts and crafts movement, the humaneness in its work, and this was to provide a framework and a precedent probably for her exploration in lacquer work. And then subsequently she volunteered to work with D. Charles. Again, this is well recorded, and here is where she first began to learn lacquering techniques. So in this slide that we have here on the screen, it's a photograph of that famous Rue de l'Auto apartment. This one now is a little later. The furniture is Eileen Gray, if I recall correctly, but the photograph is a little bit later, maybe towards the end of the late 1920s, when the apartment was redesigned once again. But what I want to illustrate in this image is that Gray's seems to have innately appreciated that lacquerware must be seen with the hands. That is to fully appreciate its sensuous quality. So it's really important to be able to touch, to feel it. And in doing this, she may have anticipated the 1930s Japanese author Tanizaki. And he believed, when he was writing his very important book on Japanese aesthetics, that darkness is an indispensable element of the beauty of lacquerware. So Gray's first interior design commission for this famous apartment also, I think, evokes Tanizaki's description of lacquer and its sparkling patterns in dark rooms. So by 1906, we know that Gray had moved to Paris permanently, meeting the Japanese sculptor and lacquer specialist Sugawara, the subject of our talk today. And Gray herself wrote, "I was very glad when Sugawara, who was lodging with some friends, came to see me, and we decided to start a workshop." So Gray went on to have a 20-year working collaboration with Sugawara, following on from this really very important meeting, very important introduction. And he was her most immediate contact with Japan. And yet it's his contribution to Gray's early career that seems to have been probably unintentionally sidelined.
And could you tell us a bit about why you think that is? It seems like in many of the biographies of Gray that I've read, it's not very clear about their relationship, and it seems like Sugawara is almost playing this sort of passive role. So yeah. Could you tell us, what do we know about him and his personality and his life?
Well, we know a little bit about his personality. We know more, obviously, about Gray's personality. We know she too was quite reserved. But until recently, very little could be confirmed about Sugawara's life or his character. And I'm sure a lot of this is to do with Gray's Western biographers. The research has been very thorough, absolutely. But for some of them, the difficulty is perhaps accessing Japanese language materials on Sugawara and his circle in Paris. And that's probably a factor, I think, in why he's been unintentionally sidelined. And that's probably contributed to the fact that he's had this very passive role in the story of Gray. But further research, and particularly, for instance, by Dr. Kawakami of the Setsunan University in Osaka, has helped now reveal a portrait of a rather easygoing character. He was meticulous regarding his work, regarding his profession, but he was very generous, it seems, in sharing his knowledge. And he eventually went on to become quite a father figure in the Japanese Parisian artistic community. And this photo that we see here on the screen, this was taken in 1911 when he was aged 26, and when he attended the Japanese Embassy's National Day reception. And I think that, judging by the little bit that I know about how these guest lists are generally drawn up, then he must have been actually quite established to get an invitation to the embassy's reception at this stage in his career. Now, as regards his life, from passport records, we know that Sugawara was born in Sakata city in Yamagata prefecture on the 29th of January, 1884. And that's in northeast Honshu. That's one of the main islands, the largest of 4 main islands of Japan. And we see it here on the left. We know that he apprenticed as a lacquer artist in Iwata prefecture. That's just up here on the top right-hand side. This is, even to this day, still a prefecture that is famous for its lacquer. And we know that Sugawara was adopted. We know, and this is quite something that's happens quite a lot in artistic circles in Japan down through the ages. And when you're adopted by a craftsman or an artist or a school, you tend to take that family name. So this is when he became known as Sugawara. And he was working for a butsudan, which is like a traditional Japanese shrine maker, and which is lacquered. But from there, he must have displayed some early talent that he decided to go down to Tokyo and enrolled in the Tokyo School of Fine Arts in 1901. And here he became, we're saying, a highly qualified, and he was, alumni of Japan's leading lacquer department, research and arts department of the time. But we do know now that actually he most likely did not graduate, even though he enrolled, that he probably didn't graduate.
And what sort of research would he have done there?
Well, it was really, at the time, the lacquer tradition was really in danger of dying out in Japan. And there's several reasons for this, mainly because traditionally it is and still is a very time-consuming, labor-intensive medium. And the artists were really, who were being trained in the traditional arts. And I'm going to get slightly sidetracked, and it's a complicated period in artistic history in Japan at this time, in the mid to late 19th century, because when Japan opened up to the West, they nearly threw out the baby with the bathwater and almost rejected most traditional Japanese arts. And so there was this terrible flux, and it was only for the American Fenollosa, who came to Japan in the 1880s, who helped to establish the Tokyo School of Fine Arts and said, no, you must look after and nurture your traditional artists. And in doing that, he set up various departments, including a lacquer department in the Tokyo School of Fine Arts. But even at that time, they had a real difficulty trying to get a lacquer master, lacquer professor. So he would have been one of very few artists. And then as Japan opened up more to the West, as these international exhibitions were happening throughout the world, but particularly in Europe, a reacquaintance, I should say, of lacquer work came about in Europe. And so the demand for lacquer artists increased, training. They were so in demand, they were being called to Europe, that he wasn't the only person who enrolled but didn't finish, because they knew they were guaranteed a job in Europe. And that's a whole other story. Okay, so we know then that he traveled from the Tokyo School of Fine Arts. He traveled for the first time to Paris in November 1905 with the Professor Sugimura, who actually had just resigned as Professor of Lacquer at the school. And it's through the travelogue of Professor Sugimura, who would write letters back to the school that would then subsequently published in the school's newsletters, that we get to know about Sugawara's personality. He writes about him and he describes the 21-year-old Sugawara as a very cheerful and innocent companion. So that's how we know that he came when he came to Paris.
And it's interesting that he didn't come for the 1900 exposition like Eileen Gray did. It's later in 1905 then.
Yeah, that's right. He would only have been 16 in 1900, possibly even still up in Iwate-ken, in Iwate Prefecture. So, but you see, I think one of the reasons a lot of people think that perhaps he came that early was that subsequent to the 1900 Paris exposition, many well-trained lacquer artists were much sought after in Europe, and the Tokyo School of Fine Arts specialist training enabled them to enabled several Japanese craftsmen to work, for example, in the very famous Parisian Galliard workshop, and that included Professor Sujimura and Sugawara. Both of them sort of left Tokyo with the intention of taking up work with Galliard. So by the time they arrived in Paris, late 1905, and they were to take up work in early 1906, and there was already a group of Japanese artisans who had gathered together, supported one another with their artistic network, and they were known as the Pantheon. And this was established in Paris as early as 1900. So this suggests that there was a sizable number of expatriate artists who were already in the city when Sugawara arrived. And as I said, he probably began work in early 1906 at the Galliard, but we do know that shortly after he began working, he became a bit disillusioned. I believe working conditions were not great in these workshops, and also shortcuts, were being taken, which I'll talk about a little later. But we know this because he sent a postcard to his brother saying that actually he was thinking of leaving Paris and going to the US. Now we know that that didn't happen, but I thought for our US audience that might be a nice little footnote. So Europe's gain was definitely America's loss. So one of the reasons that a lot of these shortcuts were being taken, much really to the horror of these specialist lacquer craftsmen, was that the process was very laborious. And this was the reason that, as I mentioned earlier, that it was one of the reasons that it nearly died out, even in Japan. The process is very laborious, and it's labor intensive. Many lacquer craftsmen often found that when they came to the West, that it prompted the Western practitioners to take shortcuts. And this was because each layer of lacquer must be left to harden for a couple of days, and then it's ground down again and it's polished smooth before the next layer is applied. And then it can take between 20 to 30 layers needed to obtain that desired beautiful luminous effect that we know from Gray's works. So understandably, given the economic conditions of the time, for these companies, time was money, and they had to remain competitive. So one of the ways they could remain competitive was to take shortcuts, and turn out and have a high turnover. But this shortcut with a combination of poor working conditions led some of the lacquer specialists to either return home or to seek alternatives elsewhere to the workshop's commercial pressures. And for example, we know that the person now that we see here on the screen, this is Inagaki, and he arrived in Paris the following year at some point in 1906. And at one stage he shared accommodation with Sugawara, and eventually Inagaki found work with Rodin. But that wasn't until a bit later in the first decade of the 20th century. So this is why Sugawara is so special, because of this really important and early meeting with Gray. He does seem to be one of the first to have a regular line of work, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
And what else can you tell us about the sizable community of Japanese lacquer experts in Paris? That's interesting that there was such a community established.
Yeah, and they do seem to have really supported one another, and not so much stuck together in a negative way, but be supportive. And I guess that doubly so, it probably worked really well for them because they were artists, and not just immigrants as well. So those who settled in Paris, including Sugawara, they seem to have lived and worked around the Rue de Tetre district. And it's interesting to note that correspondence and articles, so the Japanese are wonderful for making memoirs and recording and writing, and this is one of the reasons that we have information on these. But we know from these newsletters and articles that these expatriates, that they called themselves the Théâtre Nagaya, and this was kind of wasn't quite slum, but it was very much tenement living that they were experiencing in Paris at the time. And but in these letters they often mentioned Sugawara, and they often they very regularly, I should say, held him in high regard. He seems to have been one of the first craftsmen, as I said, to have find an artistically rewarding partnership. And because by 1907, he had started collaborating with Gray, and one of the expatriates mentioned Sugawara heading for the countryside for a couple of months with this client woman. Now, we're not 100% sure if this was actually Gray, but given the timings and things, it possibly was. But that he said that he felt like a deportee because he was having to leave the city. So, but it was really Gray's independent wealth which enabled her to hire Sugawara and others to do the work. So neither Gray nor Sugawara would have to take those shortcuts. They didn't have to bow to commercial pressures. And on both Gray's and Sugawara's artistic integrity could remain intact. So in the next slide, we see Sugawara's business card. And around 1912, we know that Sugawara tried to, and did seek some metalwork advice, possibly for a piece of jewellery that he was making. And he sought this advice from the Swiss metalwork artist who had settled in Paris at this time, Jean Dunan. And Dunan, in return, received 13 lessons in lacquer technique from Sugawara, so over a 2-month period in 1912. So at this stage, he seems to have been quite well established. The previous year, he was getting invited to the Japanese embassy's reception, and by 1912, he was giving lessons to Dunan, who, even pre-war was established. I know post-war, his career really took off, but he would have been reasonably well known at this stage as well. So yeah, so he was well enough known to be giving lessons, and he seems to have been, a very affable, helpful person, and a respected teacher and sculptor. And perhaps this was because of his non-threatening personality, combined with his professional knowledge, and that, I think, possibly was why he was the perfect collaborator for Gray, because we know of her reserved personality, but there seems to be a way in which, and I think I write in the catalogue, that she does refer in this famous, well, from an Irish point of view, a very well-known journalist called Maeve Binchy, who's since died, but she was one of the first people to rediscover Gray in the 1970s. She interviewed her in Paris, and in that interview, Binchy recalls Gray's encounter with the unnamed Japanese artisan who helped her with the lacquer, and saying, stay true to your heart. She recalled him saying to her, which in my mind, the way that she quoted him, for me, the little bit of Japanese I have is such a Japanese expression. So I do think that there was a meeting of minds, and that they just seem to have really got on very well and clicked, and have, as I say, a real meeting of artistic and personal minds as well. Also, it's important to remember that when Gray returned to London in 1915 to establish a lacquer workshop in Chelsea, it was Sugawara that she brought with her. So their professional relationship only came to an end in 1930, and that was with the closure of the shop Jean Deseux. So they seem to, probably post-World War I, worked in parallel. She knew that he was somebody she could rely upon, probably particularly for really good lacquer resin. He would have had those contacts back in Japan, and known who to recommend as suppliers. So yeah, I think they would, at this stage in the 20s, post First World War, that they would have been definitely working in parallel with one another. And because he did pursue his own work, and what we see here now on the screen is that during these years with Gray and after that, he established his own atelier, and this time he was, absolutely able to respect the integrity of the lacquer process, and he was able to employ up to 20 craftsmen at any one time. And there's lots of mentions in the, lots of references, I should say, about how many people he did employ among the expat Japanese community. So he seems to have been a good employer, a good friend, and generous, that when there was large scale work, that, you know, that he would give it out, you know, to fellow professional lacquer makers. And we know this from publications like the 1933 Japanese publication, which was called Lacquerware and Craftwork Journal. And they acknowledged that Sugawara was, and I quote, a major figure in the world of European lacquer art and has no equal in paint technique. And that's the end of the quote. So towards the end of the 1920s, Sugawara was regularly exhibiting avant-garde sculptures, such as we see here on the screen, using a traditional Japanese dry lacquer method. And these were, he exhibited at the autumn salons, and he was also actively involved in a steering committee, which as a member for the exhibition for Japanese artists in Paris. And that those exhibitions were held in November 1927 and November 1928. And he also helped to set up the Japanese art, France-Japan Artist Association. So perhaps, sort of reading between the lines, that this later period of intense independent activity may have been due to Gray's growing interest in architecture. She was well on the way to designing E1027 and really exploring architecture with Badovici at this time. And definitely she'd had a diminishing interest in lacquerware. And I know some people, you know, and I agree that probably past the mid-20s, she kind of stopped actually creating lacquerware herself.
And do we see that Sugawara ever makes it back to Japan?
Not that we're aware of. We can't really, there is no, there isn't really any proof to show that he returned, and he probably did not. If we look at this image here, which is an obituary that was written in 1937 after he died in April 37, I think this is September 1937, it does make reference to the fact that he had a family. We know now that he married a French woman who was a bit younger than him. She seems to be a polish maker. Possibly he met her through his work. But also at this time in contemporary Japan, in the 20s and the 30s, economically Japan was not in a good place. So there probably wouldn't have been that much work for a master craftsman such as Sugawara. And this is probably why lacquer craftsmen continued to come to Paris or to Europe during this period, because economically Japan was in quite a poor way for a lot of the 20s, not least because of the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923. So we do know here in the obituary that is on the screen, published by Atelier, that the ever conscientious Sugawara, that actually by this stage, by the 1930s, that he had parted company with the very influential by now Jean Dunand. And Dunand was working on very elaborate lacquer interiors for the ocean liners, the Normandy and the Atlantique. And but he too, Dunand too, was leaving out processes, certain steps in the lacquer process, and so they sort of parted company on this point. And but we do know that a lacquer artist, Hamanaka, who Sugawara had trained in Paris, worked with Dunand, so he seemed happy enough, you know, to take those shortcuts, and he went on to have an extremely successful career in his own right. So around 1930 then, according again to the obituary, Sugawara went on to work for former clients of Gray's, the Rothschild family. We know that they were clients of hers because they're in the ledger books that are associated with Jean Zeza. And Sugawara was actually staying in their holiday home in Sunny La Ville. It looks like he, at this stage, was probably kind of like a curator or their main restorer or conservator of their lacquer collection. And this was why he was there in 1937 when he passed away from liver cancer, I think it was, or liver failure in April 1937. And as I say, this is all recounted in the obituary that we have here on the screen. So in the next slide then, as mentioned earlier, Gray had started making her own lacquered pieces soon after she met Sugawara in around 1907, and she completed her first screens with his cooperation. And we know that she kept very careful notes of his recipes for lacquer, and it's just wonderful. That's in the Bard exhibition catalogue, that wonderful chapter on the books from the V&A. And certainly, if you're interested in that side of the intricacy, that's definitely worth reading and checking out. But to this day, we know that lacquer artists, and I think might have a little clip up on for this if you want to, that to this day, we know that lacquer artists are very secretive about their recipes, even today. And the Vogue article that I've just pulled out and highlighted here reference that it's forbidden to write the manner in which color is mixed with gum. So we don't know how it was that Gray came about to make this blue lacquer. She certainly is deploying a rarely seen blue lacquer, deep blue lacquer. Possibly she's using a recently developed formula which involved using bismuth chloride, and that Sugawara may have brought to her attention.
And can you tell us a little bit about the other palette that she's using, the other color palette?
Absolutely. Because as I said, we're not sure, how she came about to make the blues, but certainly there's a variation of blue was known was already known in Japan. And traditionally, the lacquer palette had been limited to 5 colors. And I think a good example of her using those traditional colors are in the next slide. Thank you. And those traditional colors are black, brown, yellow, red, and green. However, between the 1890s and around 1902, a former professor of lacquer, they really didn't last very long back in the Tokyo School of Fine Arts as professor of lacquers, because the temptation, the invitations to go abroad came fast and furious during this time. So this former professor of lacquer, his name was Rokagapu, and he actually was, along with Okokura Tenshin, he went to Boston to Isabella Gardner, and he's shown here in her garden in her well-known house, I think stateside, working on some lacquer here. And but he had created a particular type of blue lacquer. He also added additional colors such as white, orange, violet, and the blue, as I said. And this was all based on bismuth chloride. So in fact, together with the school's chemistry professor, Dr. Yoshida, he went on to establish the Nissan lacquer factory. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, we know that Sugawara gave lessons to Dunan, but we know from Dunan's lacquer recipe books, that he uses Prussian blue for his blue lacquer, so to certain lacquer resins. So this might be also how Gray created her deep blue lacquer. And really, there's probably a lot more research that could be done on this.
Like many aspects of her career.
Yeah, exactly.
So apart from Sugawara's influences, what other Japanese influence do we see in her work?
Well, to me, I think there's a lot, particularly in her early work. I think her early work is highly individual. It certainly displays Far Eastern influences. For example, the 3 figures on the Magician of the Night panel that we see here on the screen. These 3 figures are dressed in Oriental clothing. The figure on the right recalls Far Eastern dress, and the remaining 2 are dressed in clothing that's similar particularly found in Southeast Asia. This blue lacquer panel with these three figures and the mother of pearl, lotus, they're probably allegorical figures, and the symbolism and the title are based on a Buddhist mantra, because there's two titles for this particular panel. There's the Magician of the Night, and then it goes by the Buddhist mantra, but I think it's Om Mani Padme. And so the fact that it has this Buddhist mantra as well, and we know that Gray's library and her reading was so wide that it's quite possible that she was quite aware of all these different Buddhist symbols in the Buddhist religion, and I think the lotus, particularly is symbolic of that. But what we can also say about Buddhism being one such Oriental influence on Gray is that it's probably helpful to remember that in Japan, hand scrolls, or emakimono, a panel or a folding screen, that they're not to be glanced at or to be absorbed in a single glance. Rather, one moves along it as you're looking at it. And crucially, it's important to read it from right to left. So Gray may have been aware of this convention when creating, particularly when I saw this, I just thought, wow, first of all, wow, it's fantastic that it's been rediscovered. But the more I looked at it, the more I think that it's really, it definitely should be read from right to left. To me, it's very much like a hand scroll. The traditional hand scroll would be unfurled from right to left at about 30 centimeters. Each scene, would be unfurled. And to me, there's these 6 or 7 separate scenes on this whole panel. So apart from the Oriental dress that they're wearing, that the figures are wearing, when I look at this, I see these separate scenes, and to me, it evokes a hand scroll, a traditional hand scroll. But then similarly in this next slide, listing this folding screen, I think her large red lacquer screen similarly echoes Japanese painted screens, and that's both the front and the back. And if we have the next image up, and we can see both the front and the back, and that in this case, again, it's reading it from right to left, past the successive panels. We see this mysterious drama between these two blue-gray naked youths and this old man in this misty shroud. And I think that this, and it's so common to have in Japan both sides of the screen decorated. So again, I think this is another aspect of Japanese influence that perhaps Sugawara might have introduced to her, and she sort of went with that as well.
And these screens are a form that we see her return to throughout her career. Why do you think she liked making them so much?
Well, for me, I think she was probably impressed by her visit to the Paris Exposition in 1900, that perhaps she saw the 3 screens by this really famous, even in the early 1900s, Ogata Koren, who was an 18th century artist in Japan. These were shown in the, not these particular screens, but they were shown in the Japanese screens by him, were shown in the Japanese pavilion. And we see examples of works by Ogata Koren here on the screen. I think these ones are from the Metropolitan Museum in New York. So next time it's open, I would highly recommend you to go and see them for yourself. And I think that this Oriental influence, this is another Orient influence on Gray, the work of Koren and the Rinpa school, because this was an indigenous art of school established in the first decades of the 17th century. It was consolidated over successive centuries, and it was really brought to a height by Ogata Koren, whose dates are 1658 to 1716. And Gray, we know she was impressed by her visit to Paris. It's known that there was an increasing knowledge of the Rinpa school among Western scholars. The leading French scholar and collector of art mid to late 19th century was Louis Gantz, and for Gantz, the Rinpa school was Japanese art, personified. If you were going to collect Japanese art, don't mind woodblock prints, you should be collecting rinpa. And he was very strong in promoting them. And we know that artists like Gustav Klimt in Vienna, that he too explored the rinpa philosophy in his work. But what I have to do is really quote John Carpenter from the Metropolitan Museum, and wonderful exhibition that the Met held a few years ago called Designing Nature. And John writes that we must recognize, and I'm quoting here, the degree to which the formalization of Japanism is bound to aesthetic. Not just the woodblock prints and the rinpa share many common elements, such as the emphasis on the flattened picture plane, the graphic presentation of figures and landscapes, and the avoidance of shadowing and the frequent use of bold coloration. And to me, those characteristics I see in Gray's works. If we compare folding screens from the rinpa school, and what each of these images, there's 3 screens. We've just had one from Ogata Koren. This is by Watanabe, and they're all recalling a scene from Japanese literature. It's a 10th century classic called the Tales of Issei, in which irises in a riverbed are a key motif. And we see that over time, what the artists are doing is they're conveying the same subject again and again, but they're distilling the motifs down to the bare essentials. Now, this is a very Japanese aesthetic, and particularly where the rinpa is concerned. And so sometimes the motifs are embellished with the yatsuhashi, or the 8-planked bridge, which I think we see in the next image. And this is by Sakai Hoitsu, and he was probably the last major rinpa artist, and he died toward the middle of the 19th century. And what we're seeing here is the motifs that they're being distilled down to their bare essentials. Sometimes, as I said, the motifs are embellished with the yatsuhachi, with the 8-planked bridge, and sometimes not. And so for me, when we look at Gray's screens, particularly her black screens, her black lacquer, from a rinpa perspective, I think that Gray could be considered to be echoing the rinpa school's aesthetics of continually distilling the motifs to their bare essence. So here she's refining the lacquer screen panels. We see there's additions of gold and silver from this wonderful screen that's in the V&A, if I recall correctly. But in the next screen, in the next slide, there's no motifs. We're just looking at this luminous lacquer here. And then ultimately, she breaks down the lacquer even further to our next image. And all we're looking at is the bricks of the screens, and we've nothing else to distract us, the viewer, than this luminosity of this beautiful black lacquer that we see here on this really iconic brick screen.
Mm-hmm. So if rinpa was an influencing aesthetic, is there a particular school or style of lacquer within that aesthetic that Gray was following?
Well, again, here I'm not sure. Maybe if we have the next slide, and we see works by Sugawara here on the left, and then we come back to that inroad that I showed at the top of the lecture from the Koami School of Lacquer. I think maybe again Sugawara may. Going back to the Tokyo School of Lacquer, the Tokyo School of Fine Arts, we know that again, at the risk of repeating myself, the lacquer industry was really on its knees in the 1880s, 1890s. And we know that this famous school, this Koami School of Lacquer, which had been established in the 15th century, that it was favored first by the imperial family, and then it was subsequently the ruling shogunate. And so one of the Koami schools last masters was one of the Tokyo School of Fine Arts' first lacquer masters in the late 1890s, and we know then that only a couple of years later Sugawara enrolled. So what we're seeing here then is I think this connection with this really very important Koami School of Lacquer, which was very much promoted by the establishment in Japan. However, towards the end of Sugawara's life in the 1930s, the scientific development of synthetic lacquer paints, which could be sprayed on under industrial conditions, and that meant that you could still get the luxurious effects of lacquer. You know, they could be stimulated, but by you know, less costly means. And so the appeal and the influence of East Asian expanded from the elite, those elite few, which had always been the case in terms of Europe's relationship with lacquer from the days of Madame Pompadour and Queen Antoinette of France. You know, it had always been the elite in Europe that had been attracted to lacquer. But by the 1930s, we see that there is this appeal, you know, could be accessed, you know, at a far less costly means, and this really became a crucial component in the popular consumption of the glamour, the sensuality, and the exoticism of the Art Deco style.
And like I said at the beginning, it seems from Gray's biographies that Sugawara had played a passive role in her life, but thank you for showing us that that's really, in fact, not the case at all.
Well, in earlier studies, as I said, you know, Sugawara's role, you know, when acknowledged at all, it's as a fairly passive role. But if you look at the contribution, it's clear in the work itself. I think that I hope that, you know, that I've shown that he was far from passive. He actively participated in the dissemination of the traditions. We know that now from, you know, from memoirs, from newsletters, etc., and also how highly regarded he was, you know, by his compatriots. And so in this way, you know, it was very much Gray's and Sugawara's collaboration is a tale of combining Japanese Irish talent, you know, with ambition and with vision. They both seem to have vision, their own vision, but, you know, that they were able to combine and it be compatible and work in parallel, and together they created these really beautiful works. So for me, I'm not really sure, you know, whether Gray actually ever really did lose her Japanese sensibility. As collaborators together, they would have seen, both Sugawara and Gray, they would have seen how fashion sort of, you know, tended to swing polar opposites. We've got, by the time the late 20s, early 30s, we see these really bare characteristics, asceticism of the modern movement, and it was probably quite a predictable reaction, you know, to the opulence of Art Deco. And as you know, Emma, that probably the rationality and the functionality, you know, they really were the catchphrases of the modern movement. And, you know, ornament was crime. You know, God forbid that you might, you know, have any sort of ornament or decoration at all. So I think myself that as Gray found her designs evolving more in sympathy, you know, with the manifestos of the modern movement, and that's perfectly understandable. You know, I think you'd hope that you'd continually grow as an artist throughout your career. So she was drawn into the modern movement, into its architecture, you know, and so her 20 years of working in this very decorative medium of lacquer became something perhaps of an embarrassment to her, and so she moved on. And maybe in our last slide, which I think is of Sugawara, if we maybe look at him once more, that she unintentionally, I think, disowned her achievements in this most Japanese of media, and perhaps again, you know, unintentionally downplayed the significance of her collaboration with Seizo Sugawara. But even in her modern designs, it's clear to me that she had this Japanese sensibility, and albeit explored in other ways. And as the Oriental, you know, sage would have it, she whose eyes have been trained in the East will only rarely want to open them in the West. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One of our attendees wanted us to note that the Met is in fact open. So if you'd like to see those Corin screens, you can now. So thank you very much, Ruth. I think we have time for a few questions now. So I'll hand it to Emily.
Hi, everybody. As I said before, you can submit questions through the chat or through the Q&A. So I'm going to start with the questions in the Q&A as they came in. So First question, what was the major impetus for E.G.'s stopping making lacquerware? Was she simultaneously working in other media in the early 1920s, Ruth or Emma?
Well, yeah, I mean, she was doing rug designs, you know, she was doing other furniture. So I think Emma, you too would have something to say about that. Yeah.
Yep, she's working, like you said, she's working in rug design. She has a weaving workshop open. She's also working on interiors for clients and interiors for exhibition. So in those interiors, she typically is designing furnishings and fittings for the entire space. So lighting, rug designs, furniture, wall hangings, mirrors, that sort of thing. So she really seems to have broadened her her artistic scope in this period.
Would you say, Emma, that her impetus for stopping or from moving away from lacquer is just her growing interest in architecture and the kind of meeting of other collaborators, or is it too hard to identify that from the archive?
I'd say it's hard to identify, but it seems like she sort of has her hand in so many different fields at this point that maybe it's just, you know, a broadening interest.
Great, thank you. Ruth, do we know what language Gray and Sugawara communicated in and what they were most comfortable speaking?
No, we don't, but I'm thinking, you know, it was probably a combination of French, you know, maybe English. We know he went to London, so he must have had some English. We know from that wonderful chapter in the catalogue, you know, that her books of lacquer recipes, you know, that there is a combination of English and French. I love the description of how she seems to have been writing on the hoof and, you know, quickly writing some French, some English. But what I was most impressed with when I looked at those recipe books in the archives in the V&A or in the National Art Library was her spelling of Japanese words and how accurate they were, you know, phonetically. That I don't even think Dunans actually are as accurate. So maybe, and I perhaps also, you know, I know she was really well, you know, she was wealthy and had a good education in terms of like, and a member of the ascendancy would have had. But I just wonder also if she had a really good ear for languages because of those spellings in the recipe book, because they're so phonetically spot on in Roman letters, in Romanji, the Japanese words that she's using. So, but my instinct is that it was French. Yeah, that they probably, yeah.
Great, thank you. And a question about whether a video of this event will be available online. Yes, it will. We'll be posting all of the Eileen Gray programming online, and it'll live with the virtual exhibition in some way in the coming weeks. And we'll make sure we send e-blasts out that communicate this. So thank you for that question, because I do know it's 2 a.m. in Japan right now. So I'm sure, as this person pointed out, there were folks that wish to join. Another question, would the cubist block screens have been carried out in the traditional, very time-consuming method in Sugawara's workshop or in a commercial shortcut method elsewhere?
Oh, I don't know. I couldn't answer, you know, absolutely specifically on that. I mean, they're late. By the time that interior design, I mean, that was her first major commission when she returned from London after the war to Paris. So I'm guessing that she's still, herself and Sugawara, is still working very closely. Certainly up close, they do look like they were. But I'm sure at some point there must have been some resignation on Sugawara's behalf that, you know, that he too is probably not doing over, but maybe he is. I mean, I've just read something there recently, you know, that he regularly did up to 30 coats of lacquer. So I think if he was working on it, yes. But if others were working on it, perhaps not. But that's why there were so many people in the workshop, you know, there are up to 20 people in the workshop, both in Gray's and it seems in his as well. And it also, they seem to have been what was known as polishers. So yeah, you know, that's all they did was polish. Yeah.
Wow.
And we do know that for the Rue de Lota interior that that Ruth showed earlier with the black lacquer block walls, we know that Gray was working with Kichizo Inagaki at this period, who was the cabinet maker that Ruth mentioned went on to work with Rodin.
And,
so, but we do know too that she created you know, similar forms, not in lacquer, similar forms of block screens that were painted wood, for example. So she sort of moved beyond lacquer to more, I think, quicker methods of creating these forms that she loved so much.
Thank you. Could you speak a little bit, Ruth, about the reception, the Japanese reception of Gray's work? Do we know anything about if her work was received over there, you know, in that context, or anything in that
as far
area?
As far as I'm aware, no. She is written about, but in association with Sugawara. Most of the time, for some of the stuff that I have seen, most of the time they are, you know, they're getting her name right, you know, because I think I read somewhere, you know, that she was Leon. Is it in Russia? She was down as, you know, Leon. She's very much Mademoiselle Eileen Gray. So partly the katakana, or the, you know, the loan words are translated back into the Japanese, seems to have been accurately, just like I was saying, Japanese words being translated into into Roman letters. So yeah, but very much associated. She's mentioned alongside Sugawara's name, not particularly for her work. Now here in Ireland, we have recently a wonderful artist called Joseph Walsh, and who's been very much inspired. He works in wood, and he's very much inspired by Eileen Gray, and his work is really big in Japan. So you know, it's getting to be known that way, I think, you know, in a secondary way.
And there's a legacy of the work, but not necessarily Eileen Gray was so notorious in Japan. A question for both of you. Do you see the influence of her lacquer interest in her textile work, and how much of her move away from lacquer was related to health issues from the years of working with that material? Or do we know anything about the sort of toxicity, the impact of the toxicity of the material? So it's two questions, I guess. One is about influence on the textile work from lacquer, and then the other is sort of about the health implications of working with this material.
I can speak a little bit to the textile question. So we do see that in her sort of early days of designing rugs, that her motifs are perhaps more figural and less abstracted, much like her early work in lacquer screens. So we see her moving from both in rugs and in lacquer screens, from this figural practice to much more abstraction, like Ruth showed in that progression from the 4 screens near the end. So I think there's a photo in an early Vogue article of a round rug that she designed that had fish on top, and then we see her moving later to these you know, very pared down rugs with several squares in different colors of gray, that sort of thing. So I think there's I'm not sure whether there's a, you know, an exact tie between the lacquer interest and what she's doing in rugs, but you do see the same sort of progression in motif.
Yeah. And as for the toxicity, I'm not sure how much of it's an old wives' tale, but you know, you can build up a resistance. And for those people who worked in you know, it tended to be families, it tended to be handed down from father to son, and there is this sort of old tale where, you know, if you were a lacquer master and you had a child, that you would dip it in the resins when it was a baby, you know, to build up its immunity. So I'm not sure how true that is, but it is, you know, different people seem to have had different reactions, and I point of view, it does. Even today, I know of contemporaries who react to the lacquer. It's quite toxic, and they break out in a really bad rash. And I think it's recorded that she did suffer from that, but she tried really hard to persevere. But then it seems, you know, again, down to perhaps her independent wealth and her access to Sugawara, and ultimately other workers, that you know, she didn't have to put herself through that, you know, anymore. So maybe in her early stages, you know, when she was practicing, I think, yeah, she probably did. I don't know whether she built up an immunity to it, but I seem to recall that she did suffer from the toxicity of it. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Do the recipes still exist?
Well, there's a limited number of recipe books in the National Art Library in London, and you can read through them. And and I think a lot of them are reproduced in the catalogue, in the exhibition catalogue. They make some for really good, you know, if you're interested in that, it's really, you know, wonderful stuff. It really is. It's a great information, you know, to have out there. But yeah, so they do. Yeah, they do. And they're her recipes. I suppose that would want to be really stressed, because she seems to have been experimenting all the time. So wouldn't say that they're across the board, that if you were to pick it up, that would talk to a contemporary lacquer artist who's working in the traditional way, that's what they're doing, but they're definitely her recipes. Yeah.
Great, and we've mentioned the publication a couple of times, so I'm going to ask Nadia, who's with us, to post a link to the exhibition catalogue in the chat. There are also chapters of the catalogue available to read for free on the virtual exhibition website that we created in response to the closure of our gallery back in the summer, that Emma deserves a huge amount of credit. Emma and one of our colleagues who's not with us right now, Jessie Morandi, for mobilizing so quickly and making such a beautiful online resource of information. So
the chapter about lacquer is by lacquer conservator Anne Jacquin. So that's chapter 7 in the book.
Yeah. Great. 2 final questions. One is, where can we see Sugawara's work? What museums have his work, or is it available for folks to encounter out in the world?
My understanding is that anything that survived is actually mainly in private collections. That's my understanding. Yeah.
Interesting. So less available for folks to have sort of public access to.
Yeah.
And then finally, I'm just double checking that we don't have any more questions in the chat. A final question: are there any books you would recommend, Ruth, for folks that want to go deeper into this subject area? What resources would you recommend?
Oh, that's a great question. For lacquer in particular, and for great photographs, amazing photographs, definitely Philippe Gardner's book on Eileen Gray, and because the quality of the photographs are amazing. They still stand up really well. I'm looking at my library here. There is an amazing book published by the V&A, possibly coming up to 10 years ago, when they had a wonderful symposium, and actually it's name checked in the catalogue by the I'm afraid I've forgotten the author, who writes about Eileen Gray in London in the early 1900s, and how you probably remind me, Emma, in a moment, the early 1900s and how influential the Slade was in the philosophy. And in that chapter, a very famous lacquer chest, the Marmazan chest, is referenced, and a whole symposium, 2-day symposium, was organized about 10 years ago on that chest, and a wonderful book was published subsequently, and that probably is like the Bible on lacquer, if somebody wants to read about that. Again, I keep mentioning the Met, but there's some wonderful catalogues on East Asian lacquer in the Met as well, and the Getty Museum on the West Coast, they do an awful lot of work on lacquer as well. So any of those institutions would have good books, but both the Met and the Getty and the V&A, really that catalogue. If you bear with me 1 second, I have it on my bookshelf.
Emma, any additional info you want to offer?
I'll just say that that chapter that Ruth mentioned is by Olivier Gabet, and it's chapter 4 in our catalog about her Eileen Gray's British influences.
Yeah, so the East Asian, it's called East Asian Lacquer. And I probably have a back to front here, and material culture, science and conservation. But if you just put in East Asian Lacquer and V&A, that would be the book I would highly recommend.
Thank you. And just a shout out here from one of our audience members that there are so many folks that have written on Gray, Peter Adam being one of them, who has a lot of books on Gray. So there's a lot of minds in the kitchen doing various types of research on Gray. So it's a deep, wide-ranging topic that we still haven't got to the bottom of. So there's more to know, certainly. Well, thank you so much, Ruth, for being with us today, for sharing all this amazing research that you've been doing, and for closing out our series of programs on Eileen Gray. Thank you to Emma, who's been basically, apart from a couple of events, the kind of solid interviewer here, and you bring so much knowledge and insight into the material and the experience of making this exhibition as well. And I just want to thank all of you at home for supporting us virtually, for practicing social distancing, for staying at home, for doing your part to help us all get through this very strange moment in our history. So as I said before, our Eileen Gray exhibition may be closed in person, but there's much to be explored online. So if you do want to go deeper, please take a look at the virtual exhibition. There's so much to immerse yourself in. And thank you again, Ruth, and thank you, Emma, and thank you everyone for being here, and have a good rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.